Other than the book.
What's happening?
Other than the book, exactly.
Streamed or
So this actually is the...
beamed all over
Yeah.
the world?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
good, yeah, okay, then we go like that.
Oh, right. Oh, good. So this is the third single-authored book by Professor Rosenblatt, and the fourth book to her name, the other being edited by her in her very short life. In the order of their appearance, they are, in 2007, Rousseau in Geneva, in the first Discourse to the Social Contract, 1749 to 1762, published by Cambridge. 2009, The Cambridge Companion to Constant, published by Cambridge. And 2011, Liberal Values, Benjamin Constant and the Politics of Religion, also published by Cambridge. These are terrific books, all of which are marked by clear, intelligent, and stylish prose and telling arguments. Oh, I forgot to add about Professor Rosenblatt, something of no small significance. She is a very nice person. So, but today she will be speaking about her most recent book, The Lost History of Liberalism. This year in the workshop, our habit will be not to have pre-circulated papers, but just to have presentations or talks, in order to attract all of you who may not have time to fit in carefully reading a paper that may not directly connect to your interests. For it is true of all of our speakers that in presenting one dimension of other of their work, they will be dealing with issues of general concern to us as professionals and citizens. Moreover, we'll be able to see how different intellectual approaches to the subject of politics affect the nature of the knowledge they talk about. We need to be aware of this in order to give diverse arguments their due, as well as to widen and deepen our intellectual horizons. In the 1950s, W.B. Galley noted that political ideas are, for the most part, essentially contested concepts, but we have learned that even the notion of a concept may be contested, unless you are a Kantian. Liberalism as an idea, argument, narrative, or movement is surely various, if not contested. And what Professor Rosenblatt has done is to open our ideas, open our minds to important dimensions of its history. She does so because she is, by professional training and work, I think she would agree, an intellectual historian. So I shall now pass the baton of speech over to Professor Rosenblatt, who will talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and when she ends, I will ask a couple of questions about different aspects of her book and argument, and then you can all join the conversation. So let us all give a warm greeting to
Really nice. Thanks. My first event. So I'm very proud and grateful, and just one little correction, there are 2 more books. And you were going to run out.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
I have
so
2 more edited books with Cambridge French Liberalism, blah, 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 and Thinking with Rousseau, from
Are these new
Machiavelli to Schmidt.
When did you see these?
So French Liberalism from Montesquieu to the present day, I don't remember fairly recently, and Thinking with Rousseau, from Machiavelli to Schmidt.
Oh, because they're not
Oh,
up
no.
on Amazon.
Oh, on Amazon, maybe
Well,
not.
you looked at Canada when you tried
I should have. I was pressed for
It gave
time.
It gave me
I
an
hesitate to
opportunity
say.
to tell you all.
Yes,
No
exactly.
problem. No problem, no
Yes.
problem. So, thanks again. Why liberalism, and why did I take this approach? Pretty much everything that I would consider that we should original about this book comes out of its method, the method that I adopt, and you'll understand in a minute. So my first 2 books, one, as John said, was on Rousseau, and the second on Benjamin Constant, were I had a contextual approach. I was influenced by Quentin Skinner, the Cambridge School, and so they were contextual treatments, trying to understand what they meant in the period that they said wrote what they wrote. In any case, after writing these 2 books on one who's a clear liberal, considered a founding father of liberalism these days, Benjamin Constant, and the other Rousseau, who's a little bit hard to call a liberal, but who was more of an irritant, terribly important for liberals. He forced them to think about some things, and many of them reacted to and answered him in their writing. So he's also important. And what happened basically is after a while I was approached again by somebody at Cambridge and said, would you like to write a history of liberalism? And I thought, well, actually it's very interesting because there aren't that many histories of liberalism out there. People talk about liberalism, the problems of liberalism, and today you hear a lot about, the death of liberalism, the problem, the failure of liberalism and all of this, and liberal democracy is in danger, is in crisis, you hear it a lot. But I started this book like 8 years ago, so it's been a while. In those days we weren't talking like that, but in any case, there weren't very many histories of liberalism. I was very interested, and so I said, yes, I'd love to do that. And he said, go out and write a prospectus, and we'll get a contract up, and we'll get this going. First of all, I hate writing prospectuses. I think it's very, very bizarre to write what you're going to say before you know, especially us historians, to feel the need to go to archives and then write books based on what we find in the archives. So I was like, well, how do I know what I'm going to say about liberalism until, I've done all this reading? So I actually never got around to writing the prospectus or signing the contract, and maybe that was a good thing. Because I ended up writing a very different book. Anyway, I thought that I was going to write a book, really like great thinker approach, which I am an unapologetic reader of the great thinkers, even when they're white and male and dead. I think we have a lot to learn from them. So I figured that I'm going to maybe write a book where I will devote a chapter each to the great liberals, so maybe I would start with Locke and end with Rawls, and then maybe have a chapter for sure, John Stuart Mill, and then I was thinking, okay, so maybe Tocqueville, why would I do Tocqueville instead of Constant? Should I do Madame de Staël? Wollstonecraft, did I say that? I mean, surely we need a woman in there, and she's very interesting, so Wollstonecraft. And then suddenly I'm going like, who decided that this was the liberal tradition? Like, isn't this weird that I'm sitting around wondering? So I get to choose, and I start reading the few sort of histories we have out there, and somebody like Pierre Manant starts with Hobbes. Machiavelli, I think he starts with, and he has a chapter on Machiavelli and then Hobbes. So like, to me, those are not liberals. I would never put that, And I think actually people who start with Machiavelli or Hobbes are not friends of liberalism, clearly, and that's interesting too. So I was wondering how, John Locke never called himself a liberal, and there was no such thing as liberalism in his day. There was no such concept there. So how did he become a founder of liberalism? Who decided this? Traditions, of course, are constructed after the fact. And one should watch out for that because they are constructed in a way that suits the person who's constructed it. So I found that a lot of people, start with kind of a definition of liberalism, and then they construct a genealogy after the fact. And most books, when they talk about liberalism, will say, well, it's a slippery concept. It's kind of difficult. But, I take it to be the following. And then they write, they write about a history that sort of, plucks out from history the things that add up to what this person has decided is liberalism. And it's all over the place. You'll notice this if you start paying attention. They've just decided what liberalism is. I think at least it's honest if you say it ahead of you. You say, I don't know, we don't really know, but this is what I think it is. But some people are kind of even a little blurry about it, like, it's very slippery. And they use that word, it's slippery. So I said, okay, this isn't going to work for me. I want something else. I want to really be a historian. I want to know, I want some other approach. I'm going to throw out that approach. How about a conceptual history? I started getting interested in Begriffsgeschichte, more of a Koselleck approach. You know about that, and you have Corey Robin and part of your faculty here who's written, about fear, concepts like that. Some of you might have read Darren McMahon on the history of genius, the history of happiness. There are a number of these books out that take a concept and then trace its history, see how it has changed over time. The same concept, the same word often changes over time. Recently, James Kloppenberg has written a quite highly acclaimed book on democracy where he does that. What did democracy mean to the ancient Greeks? What does it mean to us today? And all of it. Well, actually, he doesn't come to today. He stops, I think, with the French Revolution. But anyway, so I decided that, so anyway, they kind of proceed backwards. I'm going to undo the stories. In other words, they decide what liberalism is, and then they tell the story that way. I said, I want to turn it around the other way. I want to start saying, like, what did it mean to be liberal? What did liberalism mean to the first people who started using the word? And then how did this change over time? When was the word first coined, and what did that mean? When did you have the first Liberal Party, and what did that mean? And what happened over time? Was it the same in Germany as in France? Who's talking about liberalism? So this is a conceptual history, but in order to keep myself honest, really honest, because it's so easy to slip into the old way of thinking, I said, I'm going to pay attention to the word. I'm not going to talk about somebody who doesn't actually say, I'm a liberal, or not quite like that, but speaks about liberalism or is accused of being a liberal or something like that. That's how I'm going to proceed. And nowadays what's fun also is that you can do word searches, right? And so you can find it that easily, and I did a lot of that. It was very mind-opening, newspapers, speeches, books, all that kind of stuff. So, what new things do we learn when we take this approach? First of all, there's a lot of talk about the Anglo-American liberal tradition. We all kind of learn, if you take textbooks and or any books, we think of it as an Anglo-American tradition. And that's why we start with Locke very often, and we think of America as the land really that invented liberal democracy, or is the prime example of liberal democracy and of liberalism. Well, when you trace the word was actually coined in around 1812. You can never say exactly when, but around 1812, in the wake of the French Revolution. And liberalism as a political concept did not enter the American political vocabulary until the 1910s. The word doesn't show up in dictionaries except when it's like the word liberalism isn't in the Encyclopedia Americana, the political economy, the main ones, the main dictionaries. When they talk about liberal, sometimes the word liberal comes up, but it very often has an E at the end to indicate its foreignness. It comes from France. Sometimes they will, when they start, they will translate a French article on liberalism. So I found that very, very interesting. Now this doesn't mean that there wasn't, the word liberal didn't exist. And in my first chapter, I trace the history of the word liberal from ancient Roman times to the eve of the French Revolution, so through the American Revolution. And I basically show that liberal started out in ancient Rome as the virtue of the noble virtue of a citizen, civic values of a citizen, as opposed to a slave, right? So it meant being, the love of freedom was part of it, freedom-loving, and a kind of magnanimity, generosity of a free man. And then over time, with Christianity, it becomes Christianized, so they talk about being liberal like God is liberal with his love. That you should, and being giving is part of it. It becomes stressed. The old meaning kind of comes along a little bit, but mainly you have this addition of giving, and you find it all over. That people should be liberal the way God is liberal in his mercy. Charity and all of this gets linked with liberal in medieval times. In the Renaissance, of course, you have a lot of conversation about liberal arts. And again, liberal men should have a liberal arts education, which should teach them the civic values they need to be leaders of society. It's a very elitist concept. Princes and nobility and citizens are or should be liberal. So it's Christianized, and then you'll see in the 17th, 18th century with the Enlightenment, it becomes what I would say socialized and democratized, so they can start talking about a liberal age. The suggestion that it can be democratized, not all the way to we're not thinking about the masses yet. They're not worthy even, well, I don't know, I wouldn't go that far, but we don't think about them. They're certainly incapable of. The noun, by the way, of course, I should have said, is liberality. There's a noun out there, which is liberality, but there's no liberalism. And liberality means this freedom, lovingness, civic values, and generosity, more and more generosity. But in the Enlightenment, you have it starting to mean open-mindedness and sociability. And you find people linking it with progress. So you have, and even George Washington will say, we live in a liberal time, this is wonderful, if there's going to be ever more liberality with education, with, and you see it in sort of, what would you say that, announcements about or explanations of clubs, the gentlemen's clubs proliferate in the 18th century, and they speak about how this is going to make people more liberal because you become liberal through conversation even. So suddenly you can become sociable, liberal by conversing with others in sociable environments. And finally you get what I would say the politicization of liberal in a new way, which is that you can start talking about a liberal constitution. And this I find happening right towards and during the American Revolution, where they start talking about the English Constitution, which they refer to it as Constitution, as liberal, and the American Revolution as liberal. What they actually mean by this, I don't believe is exactly clear. It's very much about, again, generosity, that it's open, that it's good. Yes, that there are rights guaranteed, but it's kind of mixed together. Nobody sits down and say liberalism is all about individual rights protected by a government or anything like that. It's more, it's opening, it's welcoming. There are people, priests, ministers, I read a lot of sermons. I like to read sermons. They say America is the most liberal country in the world because everybody's going to want to come here and we're going to welcome them. We're open, we're tolerant to religion. This is another thing George Washington says. When he writes the famous letter to the Jewish community, and he writes another one to the Catholic community, and the word liberal is in there, and liberality is in there, because America is the most liberal country in the world, because we are going to welcome you to America, and this kind of liberality is what's happening in America, and isn't it wonderful? Okay, so you get to the eve of the French Revolution, and they start talking in England, in France, also about. I have a wonderful quotation about Lafayette writing to his friend George Washington, saying, liberal ideas are galloping across France. People are literally, they're galloping across France. And of course, he was a great admirer of American Constitution. So he said, people here want a more liberal form of government. And isn't that just wonderful? And so they start using the word in relation to constitutions and change and so on. And one of the subject of my second book, Benjamin Constant, is one of the first ones to start using it to refer to a clear number of principles. Constitutional government, representative government with a number of rights guaranteed, of which the most important were religion and press. The most important to them always. They don't usually say individual rights, but they usually mean something like this. They're very concerned, of course, with church censorship, getting the church out of the education process, hundreds of years of collusion between the Catholic Church and the absolute monarchy. So one way to liberalize, if you will, the government was to get the church out of control, remove the control, and freedom of religion and freedom of press were essential to that. But you mustn't still think that it was just one very clear thing. Liberals, and they start calling themselves liberals two are kind of late in the evolution. They don't all agree. There are some who want, there's more or less participation, a broader or less broad electorate. Which rights should we guarantee? Should women get rights? Some say yes, obviously. Very few, but there are some. And so they have different ideas of, the church, separation of church or state, or not separation of church. They argue amongst themselves. I'm starting to use these all the time. Such a pain. Right, so, and then it evolves. What I also show here then is it evolves over time. But before I say that even, liberalism, when it's first invented, when the word is coined, is a pejorative. It's a smear word. It is really coined by its enemies, which most isms are, right? And they usually refer to heresies, Anabaptism, Lutheranism, Jansenism, atheism eventually, and liberalism. It is the ideology of anarchists and atheists. So the attack comes from its critics, and the liberals themselves, or those who say we are liberal, don't want to use the word for quite a while. And the attackers say, you're mangling this word. You call yourselves liberal, but you're not liberal at all, because you're taking away rights and privileges. You're selfish because you want these privileges that don't belong to you. And what they stand for really is civil equality. I said constitutional. I should have said civil equality is one of the first ones. And they get criticized for this, right? Because you want a country based on nobility and the three estates. You're familiar with this. There must be some historians in the audience.
Political scientists know all of them.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it. I'm sure that's true. So, some do better than others. All right, so it's a smear word. Now, again, liberalism then evolves over time. We mustn't think that there's this like basket concept that just sticks, that's just one thing. As time goes by and they confront new problems, in particular industrialization, urbanization, what they refer to as pauperism, this poverty, this class sunken poverty that it was just so visible now because they're in cities. There have always been masses of poor people, of course, but now you have them in cities where you can see them. They never seem to come out of this horrible state. They're sick, they're weak. So many of these of liberals now start to become open to new ideas about the role of government. And they get very interested in actually German ideas coming from a new school of political economists. In the 19th century, they are real path breakers in that they start saying, this abstract kind of economics based on graphs and ideas that are not based on empirical research is not, first of all, it's not humane. They're mocked by the others, but being ethical economists, they're called. And because that's supposedly a bad thing. And they say they don't understand human beings when they say about the political economists that are very current at the time. I mean, Malthus or Ricardo and all their heirs and disciples who are speaking about human beings being mainly driven by self-interest and that we should let the market mechanism take care of things. Human beings are egotistical, but let it just be and things will work themselves out. These German economists are saying, hey, you guys, it's not working out. Are you noticing that? And what you're saying is cruel. You are misreading what's going on. You don't even seem interested. Open your eyes. Look what's happening. And they say human beings also are not just self-interested animals. They're capable of generosity, of kindness, of understanding that they shouldn't behave like this to their fellow man. So this is wrong. We have to start paying attention to the poor and doing something about it. They did not call themselves liberals at first, but liberals started to listen to this. And there was words, what they call the laissez-faire economists, you know, laissez-faire, they started to call them Manchurists, Manchesterites. In other words, those who like Manchester, and you know, factories without legislation, worker legislation, and so on. And they called them Smithians. And that was a derogatory term for them to call people Smithians and Manchesterites. And the writings of these German political economists started to spread and get translated in England, and eventually in America, and certainly in France as well. And you see this in the journals that start talking about, we gotta listen to these guys, they're absolutely right. We have to find data, we have to start collecting data. How long are people, you know, what are people making, how much does bread cost, how can they save anything, how can, you know, how many people are sick, how many people are living in, and so they start collecting this, and they start saying, hey, this is the evidence, this is what we have to develop, this is how we have to build our theories, or not even theories, but our policies on fact, on stuff that we collect. This eventually leads in England to something called New Liberalism. They start to say that government needs to intervene. Government needs to do something. And there are those who say, you know, liberalism has never been against the worker. Liberalism has always been about lifting, enabling people to do better and to come out of poverty, to open up opportunities, to increase wealth, yes, but distribution of wealth too. We've always been that. Adam Smith, if you read him, was also about that. The idea was not to enrich a few people, but to help everyone. We now see that it's not working quite the way we thought, so we have to adapt our thinking. And this is not a betrayal of liberalism. This is actually a new stage. We have to react to what's going on. We have to be realistic. Liberalism, in fact, now splits then into two streams. There are some who react to these liberals, these new liberals, and call themselves classical or orthodox liberals. So my argument here is that what's called classical liberalism and is thrown around as a term, or orthodox liberalism, is a creation of the mid to late 19th century in reaction to these liberals who are saying that we need to intervene more, we need to do more for the poor. Today you'll read, people will drop this term all the time, saying that this was the kind of the ur-liberalism. You know, the first one was this classical liberalism where it's free markets and no government intervention. In fact, there was always government intervention. It's just a certain kind of government intervention. And now the American historians will say that early America too, right? If you start thinking about the kind of laws that were on the books against women, again with slaves, but not even that, tariffs and things that were there that protected certain groups of people. There's always been government intervention. And you know, the interesting thing, I still have a little bit of time, right?
Yeah.
If you look at laissez-faire in French, it was often laissez-nous faire. In other words, government, you know, and it's a bit like, you know, too big to fail, frankly. It's like, no, leave us alone. Oops, help us, you know, because they want to be left alone. But when there's a problem, then they want tariffs, they want protections, they want help, right? There was never free markets to that extent, or laissez-faire, that we think of as the heyday of liberalism in the 19th century. But now the government intervention is really on the books. People are speaking clearly about legislation, factory legislation shortening, work hours, insurance schemes, loans for people to start businesses, and these sorts of things. So you have this, but you have these people who say, no, no, we're classical liberals, government should not get involved at all, you should leave the economy to itself. And there's arguments between these two strands of liberals. You have John Dewey in the 1830s talking about these two streams. And we see them now, you know, the libertarians, they call themselves classical liberals. They are the true liberals, they say. But I will say again that this is a reading. When they talk about Adam Smith, it's a reading of Adam Smith. It's laissez-faire. What is he say this like twice in his life or something? And he speaks clearly about that even public education is necessary. Government has to intervene when you know, lighthouses, measurements, and all these things are in there. And of course, you're talking about the 18th century, so they have also a limited idea of what a government actually can do and what the problems are that the government can help with. So there's another reading of Adam Smith, but they insist that he's a radical laissez-fairist, and they are the true Smithians, if you will. They are the orthodox liberals. But others say, no, no, no. That's not what Smith meant in any way. He lived in the 18th century. We got other problems. We've got to intervene and live up to the real meaning, the core meaning of liberal. And they go back and they talk about this liberal, you know, liberality that I talked about in the beginning. They say, no, no, being liberal is also about generosity, but understanding our connectedness. Liberal it does not mean selfish, just leave me alone to be my self-interested animal and everything's going to work out. It is the new liberalism, this liberalism that advocates government intervention that gets imported into America in the 1910s. You get it around the writers of the New Republic. Walter Lippmann speaks about this. He says very clearly, this concept and word came to America in the 1910s and then spread from there. It's disseminated at that point and becomes a common word over time in the American vocabulary to mean a political position, and it means to be open to intervention. Woodrow Wilson is progressive. He calls himself a progressive, I think, in 1910 or 1912, and a liberal in 1914. It's in that crowd that you get this word coming. But you know what? They still argue over the meaning of the word very late through the 20th century, through the middle of the 20th century. Herbert Hoover says, I'm the true liberal. And eventually FDR says, I'm the true liberal. And you literally have Hoover at a certain saying, I'm giving up on this word liberal. You've polluted it of all meaning. You know, all right then, you can have it. And Hayek, somebody who is very much a free market guy, right? He does the same. He calls himself a liberal, insists, I'm the liberal. No, you're corrupting liberal. You're really socialists. This is very dangerous. Hayek, he's reacting to totalitarianism, and so he's saying they're very liberal. They're very dangerous. This sort of road you've taken here, literally, the road to serfdom. To serfdom. This is the road to serfdom. You liberals, you're calling your